tree into our thought process, what got us here, what we've dismissed, and why. I apologize if the fonts are a little small. I had some formatting issues, but just quickly, first of all, we started with what were our greatest needs. And the greatest needs at the highest level start with school overcrowding. And to address that, we have the enrollment numbers. We have changes in the program needs as to what the state requires for education based on what we need now as opposed to when these buildings were originally built. And current educational specifications. New topics, new classroom sizes, a whole bunch of things that the school folks can talk about in much more detail later. The second major issue, as Steve alluded to, was the lack of space in the current police station facilities. Accommodating the existing needs of the department, being able to again meet current standards. And again, the police folks can talk much more about that when we get into Q&A. And the third important piece, because this has come up a lot over the years, is the reuse of the existing buildings. Maintaining the historic building in the center, that being the current bachelor's school, and also to have a plan for any cascading facilities that might be vacated based on the plans that we're looking at. So the focus of study, and those of you who are here at May, we pulled this from that same presentation. This is what we were really looking at. Reviewing all the facility needs that the town has, reviewing the options, and Steve mentioned some of them are in the handout, some of them we'll be talking about here in this presentation. Looking at our priorities, determining based on cost which scenarios make more sense than others, analyzing the timelines, looking at the tax impact so we know what it's going to cost everyone, delivering a complete and unified report on all of the different issues that we looked at and all the town needs that we found, and as Steve alluded to earlier, making sure that all of the relevant town bodies and facilities are represented as part of the final process. One, to make sure that any individual group's needs are met as much as possible, but two, to make sure that we have a more complete view of what the town needs. We start with education. As Steve mentioned, that was the primary need that we looked at. And what I want to do is be very upfront with you and take a look at the different ways we thought through this, what our options are, what are the pros and cons of these options. First and foremost, one option is, of course, to do nothing, which causes a series of problems. First of all, if we don't do anything with the current bachelor's school, our class sizes and the predicted enrollment growth is going to require some kind of an action. And that action is going to be, at minimum, a series of portables, probably both at the batch and elsewhere, which brings up a series of problems, possible redistricting, appropriateness of putting the portables in the historic district, and a series of other issues as well. And of course noting that for the sake of a school, the renovations needed are more massive than for most other town uses, based on number of children, number of classrooms, size of the rooms that we have, and what have you. The renovations required to bring the batch forward as a school would be greater than what it would probably be for other issues. That leads me directly into what happens if we look to renovate the batch as a school. Well, first of all, the class size framework as far as square footage has grown drastically since these buildings were built. So in the current footprint, we will actually get less, not more classrooms, and what we actually need is more. Second, we have the issue of building yet another addition to that building in the center of the historic district with the ball fields near the common where we celebrate July 4th, and it just goes on, how building any addition onto that building would be inappropriate. And it's quite likely, although we've not taken a formal vote, that the Historic District Commission would not look kindly on additions for the reasons I just mentioned. Also, there's the issue of student displacement during renovation, either in total or in part. And again, that goes back to a portable, some other building, maybe shipping them to some other town, a whole series of relatively untenable options that would necessitate. And I know that this issue has bounced back and forth quite a bit. We do have a copy, I'm told, tonight of the letter from Commissioner Driscoll. We have asked the state SBAB, the School Building Committee, I don't know exactly what that acronym stands for, so I apologize. We've asked them repeatedly. Even though there is currently a movement to look at renovating historic schools, there are a variety of reasons that the school folks can go into as to why this would not happen here. First and foremost, that is designed for towns that do not have the space as an alternative. we have an alternative, one of which we'll be talking about in a minute. There's a series of other reasons why, even though the state is looking somewhat favorably on renovating historic schools, there are issues and problems and reasons why we would have trouble with the one that we happen to have. Continuing on with the needs of education is taking a look at what our third option is, which is to build a new elementary school at the Swan Pond site. First of all, as will be explained to you folks later, it meets all of the program and facility and other needs for enrollment that exist within the town today. It is grandfathered under the 64% reimbursement. And one important thing to note here is, if we delay building the new school at Swan Pond and come back and decide to do that later, that 64% number will no longer be grandfathered in the way it is today. It might be 50, it might be 40, it might be 56. There's a number of things that are changing, so even that same project gets more expensive in the future. 29 classrooms are proposed, which is going to support the student population. It's going to be able to support a pre-kindergarten through grade 5 school system, and it allows for all of the independent core facilities that a school really has to have. Library, music, art, technology. For anyone who was not present when we toured the Bachelor, the vast majority of these needs are either gone or have been squeezed into untenable places. That's part of what's necessitating us at looking moving forward. And of course, it's going to support all the new technology needs, because the notion of computers in every classroom is something that certainly was not thought about when the previous schools had been built. Regardless of which of these three options we look at to address our elementary problems, there are secondary school issues as well. And in this particular case, the middle school, which we're in right now, and the high school. As Steve mentioned, we are looking at appropriating funds for schematic designs at town meeting for these, and I'll show you towards the end of this discussion how that bridges our multiple phases in this project. Dr. Troughton is already working with the teachers on a feasibility study currently in progress that had already been funded by the town to figure out specifically what it is that we need, so that when we go to build these designs, they're going to make sense. We need to look at meeting the enrollment and program needs for the higher grades, 6 through 12 in our case, renovating the middle school, which has never been renovated since it was built over 30 years ago, and looking at changes to some of the core high school facilities, because there are some important needs there as well, and looking at relocating the centralized administration out of the middle school to the Bachelor building, as we'll talk to you about later, so that that gives us added room for classrooms and services that we need here. And both of these projects would be eligible for state reimbursement. We just can't tell you exactly how much yet because of the new formulas I mentioned earlier. The second major issue, as we discussed at the top, was the public safety needs. And if we look at this, this is primarily around the current police station. And again, we have three options. The first is to do nothing. Well, if we do nothing, first of all, we have existing liability and security issues, which the Police Building Committee can go into in more detail for us later. We have seriously inadequate space for the current needs of the existing department, and we have very deteriorated working conditions. Issues around air and heating, issues around sanitation, and several others that, again, we could go into more detail as appropriate later. It is our understanding that there are not these type of issues with the fire station, which is why our primary focus has been around the police station. The second major option is to renovate and expand the existing police operations. First of all, there's limited space for an addition. You've probably heard about the discussions that it would need to be behind it, would need to be up on stilts. There are certain issues there. Massive renovation of the current space would be required to update that to current standards. And the analysis of looking at renovating and expanding the current facility is in the same ballpark of what it costs to build a new facility with all the benefits that that new facility would bring. Which leads me to our third option, which is looking at building a new police station. First and foremost, it will accommodate all the needs of the department. It will comply with all the current standards of what a police station facility should have. And the town owns the proposed site behind the current Murphy Center Town Hall, so there wouldn't be acquisition costs. One of the questions that has come up in the newspaper, in previous meetings, etc., is, why didn't you think of this? What did you do about that? What I've tried to do in the next two slides is take a look at some of the major things that we considered and why we dismissed them so that you can understand our process. There is more detail on these and other options that we looked at in the handout that Steve Jervy mentioned earlier. First of all, there are several things we looked at relating to the current Batchelder building. One option was to sell it, to lease it, or to rent it. And one important notion that came to a lot of people's minds was it's an important historic building. It should be kept under public service. Secondly, there was an analysis done about looking at the cost for renovation, and it was deemed infeasible for a private enterprise to undertake that. And again, there's more detail in the studies that we could talk about. The second two, we looked at the possibilities of moving the police station or the fire station into a part usage of the batch. First and foremost with the police is a security issue. The police station really should not share a facility with other town facilities, and there would be the requirement for some additions around the first floor that again we could discuss in more detail later. The fire station would also require an inappropriate addition. In this particular case, we'd have to build whole bays for the fire trucks, which again is something we really should try to avoid at that building, at that site in our historic center. In addition, if you think back over the last several years, we've spent a significant amount of money fixing the floors, working with those bays. It really seems silly to throw all that away and start over and have to build new. We also heard about the option of selling the Swan Pond property, but think about it. We live in a town that is primarily built out. That's a 36-acre site. We really didn't believe that that was a wise use of open town space. We also were asking and looking at the possibility of returning the Murphy Center to a school. There are site and building inadequacies. There is uncertainty as to whether reimbursement would be happening from there. The site would probably require a multi-story building. There are a variety of reasons. Again, we can go into a lot more detail on why that didn't really make a lot of sense for us. There was also the notion of looking at building a new high school. And if you look at towns like North Andover and others, you'll understand that that is a huge undertaking financially. In addition, we really don't have as adequate a site for a high school. It makes much more sense to look at elementary needs at the Swan Pond site. And we performed significant renovations 10 years ago. It's designed as a high school. It really makes sense to keep that going and simply do the improvements we need to keep that operational. We also heard a lot of talk about the Berry Center facility, and the town doesn't actually even own that. So that really is an option right now. We don't know what the state's definitive plans are for that property. So what are the conclusions that we reached and what brought us here today? We looked at the school options and determined that a new school was the most cost-effective option, and it was the most effective way to build it in looking at elementary needs for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Long-term middle school and high school needs must be addressed, and renovating the existing properties appears to be the right way to go. The new police station best suits the long-term needs of the community from a security perspective, from a liability perspective, from what the police officers need to get their job done, and all around, that made the most sense. The fire department, we also believed, was most important to keep in its centralized facility. If you think about it, the police are often out in their cruisers and they're all over town. So it's more important, we believe, that the fire station remain central, as well as I said, we spent the money on the bays, and if we move the police facility out of there, we can allow them to expand into the rest of the building, giving them improved and increased space as well. We're also looking at important around the Batchelder reuse, because we know that that's very important to a lot of people in town. We want to maintain, as I said earlier, this important historic building for town use, in town control. We, as Steve said earlier, will look at moving school administration to part of that building in either of the two plans we're looking at. And the third plan is looking at balancing, frankly, town needs versus town wants. There are those in town who believe there would be significant advantage to moving town hall back to the center. There are also a significant number of people in town who consider that a luxury we cannot afford. We believe that providing two options for what to do with the batch and looking at both of those as we go forward helps to address both of those sets of needs and allows us to determine what will be the most sensible use as we get that data. Continuing along here, we looked at the Murphy Center as well, and we believe that retaining it for some public use is important, especially if the police station ends up on that same parcel of land. And again,